title of our session is very similar to the title of the conference. So we will attack the main theme of the conference with the help of our invited speakers. So I will start with, Euclid Tsakalotos. He is professor of economics at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, ex-finance minister of Greece, and member of parliament of the Greek parliament. So Euclid is going to speak on alternative economic policies in a world without a hegemon and with no hegemony.
Okay, thank you, Maria. Thank you to the organizers of the conference for the invitation. I'm going to start with two pieces of bad news, and there will be a piece of good news at the end. I've left the good news at the end so that Maria won't cut me off in a miserable situation of just the bad news, but will give me extra time to be able to say some of the good news as well. So I'm going to start with the lack of a hegemon, and although there is a big debate that what we're facing in the world is a return to the 1930s, rising inequality, the rise of the right-wing forces, ultra-right-wing forces, I'm going to take you back to the First World War and similarities that are worrying just before the First World War. So in 2012, Christopher Clark wrote a book that was very famous and very well read, called The Sleepwalkers, where in a very long book he looked at great detail at all the participants, and participants that hadn't been studied so much, like the Serbians, for instance, or the Hungarian bit of the Austrian-Hungarian. And basically he looked at the how of the First World War rather than the why of the First World War. Now this is an important distinction, because even by the title you begin to understand that the how of the First World War was a set of decisions that led to the war without any necessity or even any intentionality. Now, very recently, Perry Anderson, in the very Perry Anderson mode, has done a review of this book where he praises Christopher Clark to the skies, saying this is one of the most brilliant books, and the analysis of what Belgians were thinking and what the Serbians were thinking. You should always be very worried if some Perry Anderson starts praising you, because it's like a huge introduction to what he's going to say at the end, where he's basically saying that Clark is wrong, and that Clark is responsible for what Perry Anderson calls the fallacy of immediacy. What he says, in fact, is that of course actors have some freedom, and there's some determinacy, some contingency, and sometimes things are not inevitable, but the First World War was not one of them. And let me say some of the questions that Perry Anderson sets to set out the ground that the First World War was very likely. And he says, could the social order of Europe have shed their elites, their habits and outlooks? First question. Second, could the great powers have renounced imperial objectives? Second question. Could the diplomats have forsworn military alliances? Could economic development have become more even? Could overseas possessions have been more equally distributed? Now, Perry Anderson then says that that doesn't necessarily mean that the First World War was inevitable, but then he states three sets of considerations that made a war more or less likely than not likely. The first is the failure of all peace initiatives, and he mentions the two very well-known peace conferences at The Hague in 1899 and 1907. The second, the conviction of many politicians in all countries before 1914 that a war was inevitable. And the third, the escalating tempo and sequences of international crisis. Now, I don't want to worry you, but it seemed to me that all three of those exist at this moment. We have failure of one peace initiative after another in Gaza, in the genocide there, in the war in Ukraine, in the war in the Sudan, and so on and so forth. We have a conviction of many politicians, including many European politicians, that we should be preparing for war, that war is very inevitable. And we have an escalating tempo and sequences of international crisis after 1908. The similarities seem to me to be quite close. So the first worrying aspect is that war is now not inevitable, but people are thinking in those terms, are planning in those terms. And really, we have a lack of a hegemon. Now, a hegemon is not somebody who is working for the common good, but at least attempts to be pretending to be acting on the common good, that he's representing. I'm using he the country is representing itself as defending democracy or the liberal state, and there's some pretense to it. The argument I would make is after the Iraq War, and even now with the genocide, that doesn't exist. So the United States and Israel have a very obvious policy in the Middle East. So they have a few countries that are client states that are so economically dependent on the United States, Egypt and Jordan being the obvious ones, where they will not move at all against US-Israeli interests. And they have another number of states, Syria, Iraq, Libya, that are basically the strategies to make them ungovernable. To have spheres of influence, to have warlords, just like in the Middle Ages. Now that is not a hegemony. If you exclude the pathetic European leaders who are bending over backwards to cut welfare spending, as Maria told us, in favour of military spending, the rest of the world is not convinced that what's happening in Gaza is a hegemon working for the common good, even pretending to act for the common good. In fact, Trump doesn't even claim that he's acted for the common good, but to make America great again. So we really have got a lack of a hegemon in this very, very tight sense, that there is no country that is even pretending to be trying to support the world's social order on the basis of some moral superiority. So that is the lack of the hegemon that we should be worried about. The second is that we should be worried about, but if I'm allowed the extra time, I will get to, is the lack of hegemony. What has happened, my own view is that neoliberalism is dominant in the world, but it's not hegemonic anymore. And something very seriously has happened at the level of ideology with neoliberalism, because two central channels of the ideology of neoliberalism have been broken. The first is that profits are turned into investments. The second is that those investments increase productivity that increase the real wage. Those two links, which are absolutely vital to why we should have private sector, why we should allow the private sector to decide investments, have been broken. Compared to the pre-neoliberal era, we have in profits that are not turned into investment, the percentage of investments is much lower than the previous, private or public, and wages are basically stable. So a crucial aspect of the neoliberal era has come to an end. Now, one of the things that I suppose my three fellow speakers might take on is whether rearmed Europe is an answer to that. Is rearmed Europe an answer to the breaking of those two linkages, that it will increase investment, it will diffuse technology, and we'll have another cycle of growth? My answer is no, it won't do that for various reasons. In part because it will would actually reduce green development and social expenditure, in part because military spending will have little diffusion of skills and technology to other sectors of the economy. But now for the good news. I don't know if I'm on time for the good news. We all have discussed, there's this important contradiction. Everybody is discussing the rise of the new right, but nobody, apart from the far right, actually believes that it answers any of the questions of the multi-crisis. Nobody really believes that they have answers for social inequalities, for the climate crisis, for the housing crisis. In fact, it's difficult to believe that Trump has any answer to those questions. So the Trump tariff, reindustrialization, proper jobs, lifetime jobs that we used to have in Ford and General Motors and General Electric and so on, I mean, it's not credible that his strategy of tariffs is going to do that. I mean, 10% of workers now, of all American workers, US workers, work in manufacturing. In the 1970s, it was 20%. Maybe this strategy will take us from 10% to 12%, but that's not going to make a big difference. But I'm going to say something more important. Why we are in crisis is, at the moment, there is no far-right, centre-right, centre-left strategy which will take us back to a stable economy and stable politics. In other words, all three strategies, far-right, centre-right, centre-left, seem to fail. So Biden leads to Trump, Scholz leads to Merz and the AfD, Macron leads to Le Pen, Starmer is more brilliant than any of these. In 1 year he's led to the rise of Farage to 30%. Now that is important. What does it mean? It means that there is no strategy that I can see of a return to the two-thirds society. In other words, there's no strategy of the far right, the right and the centre-left that can do the favours of the rich and the elites and the fossil fuel companies and the big tech companies and so on, and at the same time address the problems, the social problem and the ecological problem. That seems to me obvious, because all these governments are continually failing and we're asking ourselves what. And that's the opening for the left. That's the good news. The opening for the left is that it needs to develop and is developing a strategy, if and only if it accepts that, if and only if it accepts that the climate crisis changes everything. And in my view, the climate change brings to the fore the three main concerns of the left through the ages. The first is production and consumption models, the second is redistribution, and the third is democracy. What decisions are taken collectively and what can we leave to the private sector? I have used and have written a book on all three of those pillars, the production and consumption model we need, the redistribution we need, and how we return to democracy for control. But let me just say this, and finish with one final article. In 1995-96, Stuart Hall, who is one of my heroes, who was professor of cultural sociology at Birmingham, wrote an article, Gramsci and Us. And I think everybody should read that article. It doesn't matter if you agree with it, you'll be a better person, a better economist, and a better strategist if you've gone through the experience, whether you agree with it or not. What does Stuart Hall says? Stuart Hall says that Thatcherism and the decline of social democracy is an important moment in history. It's changing a shift from social democratic consensus to neoliberalism. Just like after the Second World War, we had the reverse process towards a social democratic consensus. What Stuart Hall says in that article is criticising the left. And he says that the left is always late in understanding these huge changes that are undergoing. It talks of crisis, but it doesn't really believe it. It always believes that capitalism is the same, it does the same kind of things. The left, he says, will never regain hegemony with a little bit of welfare spending here, a little bit of state development strategy there. We'll bring it all together and we'll beat the right. Stuart Hall in 1985, did I say 95 before? In 1985, just at the beginning, in the middle of the Thatcherite era, says that ain't going to happen. We're not going to regain hegemony with a little bit of social democratic welfare spending here, a little bit of an investment development state there. We need to rethink the new era and what has happened. And that's what the left has to do. Because when I say about the production and the consumption model and the redistribution, I'm talking about AI in a serious way. I'm talking about how you challenge technology. I'm talking about let's consider the good bits of the degrowthers at something serious, a strategy which actually takes up, and that's why, whereas the reformist who was here before, that's why I think the reformism is wrong. I think it's wrong that it too easily will give up the ideological battle. Because I grew up in England in the 70s when the right was saying incredible things in the 70s. Privatise the air. You'll probably remember Friedman's son. Privatise the judicial system. Privatise the police. People should choose which police force they should enforce. They had those ridiculous ideas, and that's why, when they were in power, they could do less ridiculous things, but they won the ideological ground. And the ideological ground, and this is my last statement, Maria, the ideological ground that we are now in is that there is no right, no centre-right, no far-right strategy that can combine appealing to the elites and dealing with the social problems and the problems of ecology. And thus we need much more radical thinking to be able to confront that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Euclid. The floor is now to Tobias Pflüger, researcher and member of the board of the Information Center for Militarisation, Germany, ex-member of the European Parliament and the German Budenstag. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. My thesis is that with the rearm program, now the imperial power European Union is ready. And it has taken a lot of years, but now all the components are ready, and it's obvious, and they say very clear what are their goals. And I believe that the circumstances are so that for the development of the imperial power European Union have been good, in question marks, special the situation that in the United States there is a president which the elites from the European Union can't say what he is doing, and it's obvious that he has another agenda and so on, and it's for them it's wonderful because now they can say it very clear, they want to be the imperial power as European Union. And I think that's important for an analysis. 21 years ago, I was writing my PhD thesis about the European militarization of European Union. I haven't finished it because some senior people of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation asked me if I will run for an independent candidate for the European Parliament former PDS. And I was there 5 years, and I was responsible in the UN group, the left group, for the military questions. And I've seen as they prepared step by step the European Union. It was the treaties, the so-called Lisbon Treaty was very important for the developments of this military power European Union. Some parts that they have written inside that all member states have to increase their military budget, and it is in the treaty. And, so something happened. Okay.
Sorry.
And it is in the treaty that the budget had to increase. And also in the treaty there is something, it's a new European External Action Service. What was very interesting for me, that they do the military, the foreign and the development all in one. And I always have learned that special development policy should be absolutely not in the same as military policy. And they started a lot of instruments. The funniest instrument is the so-called European Peace Facility. It sounds wonderful. And this peace facility it does the opposite what is the name, because with this facility they finance the weapons, and now they use this and another instrument special for financing weapons to Ukraine, but also to a lot of other states, and they name it European Peace Facility. Then they created permanent structured cooperation, so-called PESCO, in which the armament of the different European states are supported. And I learned in a special group in the German parliament, I was later a member in the German parliament, and we looked to this PESCO, and it was obvious that in this they helped the armament industry to work together and to have common projects and so on. They started a project, what is very important now, the so-called military mobility program. With this, it's organized that the troops through Germany come to the east. And Germany is responsible for the infrastructure, and it's called military mobility. It's a program from the European Union, what is now special financed also from Germany. These are only some steps of what is going on in the militarization of European Union. And some days before, Ursula von der Leyen made her speech about the 800 billion and 150 billion programs. There was a debate before the coalition in Germany starts. They have decided to have two programs. And I think that's very important to know that, unfortunately, the leading nation in the European Union, they go in front, and they decided to have an infrastructure program with 500 billions. Euclid was talking a little bit about it. And this program, and that isn't in the debate, in the public debate, the first criteria to get money from this are the military criteria. So everything what should be financed from this First, military, special the mobility program. So bridges and all this, is it necessary for military use? Yes, then the money comes. Isn't it? Then the money doesn't come. I discussed with some of the Deutsche Bahn responsible, and they say they are looking forward to get money, but in the moment it doesn't look like they get money only when it is special for military use. So this is the priority, and from this 500 billion program, the former Minister Volker Wissing says it's very open. We have the priority for military use, and the others will be also done. And then they have a second program, and that was never done before. They have decided to have 300, 500, 700 billions for the military. And the funny situation was that it was said nothing, Mr. Merz says, whatever it takes. It was open to the end, so no limit. And in the moment there is the situation, I am again working as advisor in the German Parliament, that you see the budget 2025 and 2026, and it's really the military ask and they get it. And it's increasing 80 billions, then 100 billion, then 150 billion, and it's increasing enormous. And this will be an example for all member states of the European Union. So it's obvious what will happen. The priority is clear. And when you ask why, you always get a very interesting answer. We have to prepare for war because 2029 Russia will attack Europe. And then you ask, do you have any concrete things about this? And I know from the internal briefings, no, they don't have anything about it. What they have is this, what happens, what we see, but there's no concrete, they will attack. And what is important for me is, they prepare for war in two different ways. They always speak about defense. No, it's about defense and attack. I see the weapons they buy. It's about attack drones. I see the strategy, what they discuss. I see what they, in the maneuvers, what they are doing. Very interesting situation. Always, in Germany, you have blue against red. Red was always the Russians. And I was, as a member of the parliament, I was there and asked why blue is attacking red. Because red attacks blue and then we have to defend it. No, we have to do both. Blue is attacking red, yes. So they prepare really both defense and attack in the weapons, in the strategy, in what they are doing in the maneuvers. And I think that's a very important debate. And now we have the situation, it's called, from the former Chancellor Schröder, Zeitenwende, time changing. In all areas, from the health, from to them. What they are saying is obvious. And now we have to handle, there is an imperial power, European Union, with all what they need. And we, as leftists, we have only the possibility to fight against, because the political parties, the overwhelming majority is in favor. From Greens to the right wing. I call it always the military-industrial political complex from Green to AfD in Germany. And the left, you have always to help back, not to be far, not to slip up, also to be in favor of this militarization. And now, in Germany, there's something growing up, a movement, special because the youth should go to the army. And a big majority of the youth say, no, we don't want. That's my hope. And so perhaps the youth say no, not only that they have to go to armies, but also say no to this new imperial power, European Union.
Thank you, Tobias. Thank you, Tobias. We are now ready to listen to Monica Clua Losada, Senior Professor of Political Sciences at the University Pompeu Fabra, Barcelona. She is going to speak on alternatives to genocide. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you especially to Marika and Maria Daphne for all the work in organizing this conference. And in my contribution, I want to focus on what I think is the central issue of our time. And I think the central issue of our time is Palestine and the genocide being perpetrated in Gaza by Israel, with the connivance of its allies, including the EU. But I also want to think of alternatives. So I don't want to focus not just on something that would cause serious despair, but actually to provide some hope. I think it's more important than ever to think of alternatives to actually provide hope at a time of utter despair and desolation. So first, I argue that the genocide in Gaza, as I mentioned, and the title mentions, I think, is central to the neofascist global project, and also to the theme of this conference, militarization in the EU. Second, I want to focus on specific aspects of the further militarization drive. And so rather than calling it militarization, I would call it further militarization, because it's not something new. And I think it needs to be understood within the context as well of this genocide. It's happening at a time where EU countries have spent the last decade militarizing under the auspices of securing their borders and their populations, and I think it is part as well of that project. And it is also coming in the context, as many of the panelists throughout this afternoon, and I suspect tomorrow, have been talking of a never-ending war in Ukraine, and, as I mentioned, the decade of technological militarization of Europe's borders. And finally, the final section, I think it's nice to finish on a hopeful element. I will focus on alternatives, or perhaps at least the ways in which resistances, or different types of resistances to militarization, genocide, and technological-driven repression in our borders have been taking place, particularly in the context of the Spanish state. In fact, I think resistance, and specifically the Palestine solidarity movement, has been successful at raising awareness, enacting policy change, and providing some rays of hope. So, as you are all aware, I suspect Spain has been one of the few countries in the EU that has maintained a constant and more critical stance in opposition to the genocide. In fact, it was the first EU country to recognize the state of Palestine, something that we're talking a lot about in the last 24 hours due to the British recognition of Palestine. And it has also stood up, at least discursively, at the proposal of increasing military defense budgets to 5% in the EU. And I hope to show that the explanation, rather than to be found in Sanchez's leadership, even though that is what many people would like to think, is actually to be found in how strong and widespread resistance movements have been, which have actually forced Sanchez, that comes from a party that has not been partial to militarization in the past. In fact, one of NATO's general secretaries in the late 90s came from his same party, and it's also a party responsible for state-sponsored terrorism against its own population in the 1980s, so clearly those things do not bother them very much, but they have actually forced Sanchez to stand up to genocide and militarization of the EU, so we'll try and understand why. As I mentioned, the first part, I want to focus on how the genocide in Gaza is central to the neofascist global project, and for that I would like to recommend that you read, even though I will go through them, but I think two very important documents. One is easier to read and source than the other one, but if you do manage to find the other one, I think it's worth a read, or certainly the press coverage around it. The first one is a document from the Heritage Foundation. I'm sure you all have heard of the Heritage Foundation. They have been the ones that wrote Project 2025, which is pretty much kind of the document that supposedly Trump's policies are based on. But they also have a very interesting document that is called US-Israel Strategy, From Special Relationship to Strategic Partnership, 2029-2047. And this document sets out what they consider to be the US-Israel alliance for the next couple of decades. The other set of documents that I think give us some interesting insights into why it is such a central project are the leaked documents to the Washington Post about a month ago that you might have read some of the coverage related to the Gaza project. And this Gaza project from the US government is also connected very strongly to Tony Blair's foundation and what is starting to be called in the press as Project Gaza. In a nutshell, it's a project to replace the population of Gaza by whatever means possible and create a kind of real estate haven for property developers and so-called technological innovators. So again, you see in all different panels how technology is also playing a big part in what we're talking about in terms of militarization. In fact, I think, and I'm going to refer mostly to the Heritage Foundation special report, that what we're witnessing really is a continuation of the neoliberal depoliticization project that we have seen since the 1980s, but now applied in, shall we say, more barbaric ways. In fact, this neoliberal depoliticization project worked very well for the imposition of austerity over a decade ago, as many people in this room know, and certainly one of the people in this panel knows probably better than many of us. And this is basically using the same route of austerity, but for militarization. According to the Heritage Foundation, the relationship between the US and Israel is so important that it must be insulated, and I'm using their own words, insulated from political pressures. And therefore, the new Memorandum of Understanding, which would replace the existing Memorandum of Understanding between the US and Israel, that they're hoping to achieve must be, and pardon the pun, bulletproof, to ensure that any future government or any future pressures from any kind of resistance would not put it in jeopardy. This has to be something that goes way above any kind of democratic pressure. In fact, this is very important in every aspect. If we, as I have been arguing for many years now, focus on resistance in order to understand domination attempts, it is clear that they're now not willing to risk another decade like the period between 2011 and 2019. And here I'm adding a little dose of hope again, perhaps. I argue, and I have argued in the past, that during that period they nearly lost control. some of the pillars of power were in danger. And we shouldn't underestimate how much of a challenge organized resistance to austerity presented during that last decade. I actually don't think we realized then, and I don't think we realize now, how close we were to wherever winning might be. Or at least how close or how much we actually scared them. Going back to the Heritage Foundation, however, that are very aware of that much more than we are. And the Heritage Foundation also considers in that special report, and again in their words, that the United States is facing a grinding war in Europe. They're concerned that this, they refer to the war in Ukraine, even though, by the way, they don't mention the war in Ukraine or the word Ukraine at all in the entire report. And they're concerned that this will pull away some of the resources from the Middle East, which they consider to be of strategic importance. So they worry a little bit about that. And they also, and again in their words, want to end Israel's reliance on US military financing. So, in a way, they want Israel to start becoming a little bit more independent, or rather, they need Israel to start becoming a little bit more independent. And perhaps, and they don't say that in so many words, I say that, a good way of achieving that is to increase the economic ability of others who might purchase those technological and military goods from Israel. In fact, and I'm going to now move to the militarization of the EU, we have already been doing that for a long time. The EU has been purchasing Israeli military and technological goods for a long time. In fact, we are one of their main business partners, if you want to call it that way. For example, you might have heard of Frontex, the EU border force, if we want to call it that way. Most of EU's border securization today is done by drones. And the entire fleet of drones that Frontex owns are Israeli-made. Every single one of them. In fact, the genocide hasn't made a difference to that. In 2024, the EU bought even more drones from Israel. In fact, last year, Frontex flew double the amount of hours of drones over the Mediterranean Sea than it had done the previous year. Right? And also, it doubled the amount of people that died in the Mediterranean Sea. According to the International Organization of Migration, over 2,400 people died. And that, for Frontex, is a success, because it means they didn't reach to the coasts of Europe. The policy, and that is above, thank you, and the policy is essentially to let people drown. And the use of Israeli drones help very much for that, because they have been trialed and tested in Gaza as part of the way in which they can be sold to others. In fact, Israeli tech in general, including the kind found on some of the migrant camps on the Greek islands, is a central part of the EU's infrastructure. It doesn't stop here. In fact, Bloomberg reported only a couple of months ago, and this was their headline, Israel aims to be the world's arms dealer. In their subtitle, and this is Bloomberg saying it, certainly no one from any kind of Palestine solidarity campaign, or not even myself, just to be clear, the subtitle states, as Europe boosts defense spending, Israeli producers see an opportunity for arms sales and a chance to become more self-sufficient, something that the Heritage Foundation wants them to become. But let's see how much we are actually spending. So, we're not just spending, but we're also exporting to ensure that the genocide continues. In fact, in terms of exports, even Spain, this great country country that apparently has stood up against the genocide, happens to be the 5th largest exporter in the EU of arms and ammunition to Israel, all the way until 2024. It isn't clear what in 2025 whether this has stopped or not. Suppose we shall see. Greece is not much better, just as an example, just to be clear. In fact, Greece, for example, signed in 2019 a $1.6 billion arms deal with Israel, and they also have a 22-year public-private partnership with Euclid Systems, one of the main war technological companies in Israel. So, and we could go probably through every single one of our countries and we would find equally appalling data. In fact, Europe as a whole, and this is reported in the Times of Israel, so again, hopefully not suspected of any kind of interest on the other side. The Times of Israel on the 4th of June 2025 reported that Europe was the largest purchaser of Israeli defense goods, buying 54% of the total exports in 2024. 2024, when the genocide was already going on, Europe bought 54%, up from 2023. So it looks like genocide is good business, amongst many other things. And in fact, The Economist, another non-suspect, just a couple of days ago had the headline saying that Israel's arms exports are increasingly making it sanction-proof. And Israel gains diplomatic insurance by supplying weapons crucial to Europe's defense. There's no way we can engage in this level of militarization without what Israel can provide to us. It is absolutely essential. I'm not going to go through some of the more technological elements, but for example, another company which is connected, it's a US-based company, but very much connected to the genocide that you probably heard of, Palantir, have just secured a 20 million euro contract with Spain, of all countries. Yeah. So the discursive anti-genocide element does not necessarily match the pocket. But, and let me finish in terms of some of the alternatives and resistance, so that we don't finish on a Monday evening in a complete element of desperation. Why has then Spain, whilst still buying Israeli goods, whilst still engaging in the arms and ammunition trade with Israel, has appeared as somehow moral compass against genocide, or at least why has Spain's Prime Minister appeared to do so? Well, Spain has been, over the last year and a half, or nearly 2 years, really engaged in, like many other places, in developing a very large Palestine solidarity movement. From encampments and universities, for example, the first one being at the University of Valencia, but perhaps the more successful one at the University of Barcelona last year, where they managed to be, and I hope memory doesn't fail me, but if not the first, one of the first universities in the world to break relationships with Israel. They have also conducted plenty of general strikes against the genocide. In fact, the last one was last Thursday, where there was an international day of action against the genocide, and there was a 1-hour general strike called by some of the unions. There have been very successful BDS boycotts. At the moment, there is a boycott going on against Carrefour, which has even managed to close down the large flagship Carrefour store in the Rambla Street in Barcelona only 2 weeks ago in the middle of an afternoon, so certainly quite successful. There have been very successful boycotts all through this summer to music festivals that were organized with Israeli funds and kind of investor funds that do these kind of music festivals. And probably you will have seen in the news over the last few days where the kind of the Tour de France equivalent to Spain, La Vuelta, the cycling tournament, the most important cycling tournament of the year, was actually won by the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, because they were unable to finish the tournament due to widespread protests. So I think it's interesting because, as I say, it has become one of the key states, Spain, which appears to have stood up against both the increase in defense budgets in the EU, but also one of the most vocal and certainly EU countries against genocide in Gaza. However, I do think it's important to highlight that there are very important differences between the public discourse of Sanchez and his government and the reality of what Spain actually is doing. This is not to downplay by any stretch of the imagination the importance of Sanchez's role in this. I actually think it is quite important that there is that element of standing up from someone who is the president of a country. However, it is also clear he's not doing that out of the goodness of his own heart or even out of his own ideological conviction. He's being very much pushed by the wave of solidarity with Palestine, and he basically has been left with no alternative thanks to popular mobilization. To me, that demonstrates in a way how important that popular mobilization is, because this would not have happened without it. Of course, again, the domestic context matters. He's governing in minority, and I'm nearly finished. And those who are supporting his coalition government are all to the left of him. The alternative really is a rising far right that if it goes an election, they will probably win. So his time in power is very fragile, and the right is becoming increasingly more extreme. There is also the issue, of course, that the movement of arms and ammunition continues to happen through Spain, and even though they have committed to not allow the guns to pass through Spain, through either airspace or actually stopping there, it is very unclear that will actually be possible. In fact, as you know, thanks to our history of Francoist dictatorship, we do have the country full of US military bases, and there is very limited kind of power that the state can have over those bases. That was just one of the things I wanted to finish on. But just to finish now, for certain, the importance of resistance in order to stop those trends, which I think are really, really dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. And now we pass to the last speaker. We pass from political sciences to economics. Our last speaker is Anna Maria Simonazzi, former professor of political economy at La Sapienza University of Rome. She is an expert advisor at the Italian Council of Economics and Labor, the president of the Giacomo Brodolini Foundation, and the managing director of Economia and Lavoro, a very well-known Italian journal. Anna Maria is going to speak to us about the rearming of the next war, the battle of the dollar.
Thanks, Maria. I'm very well aware of the time, and I won't say I will be brief, because be aware of those who say that. So, I will go back to the issue of the hegemon, or the lack thereof, and the attempt of the present hegemon to try very hard not to disappear. And this is the outline. I'm going to talk about the great design of the United States, mostly in terms of the currency, of the dollar, and financial hegemony of the United States. The use that Trump and the US administration is doing, or is trying to do, or perhaps thinking of doing, of stable coins and of the response of the European Union. So, let me start with two sentences. At the beginning of this conference, it was mentioned Stellan Mirren. And I will start with two quotes. The first is by Trump himself. He wrote this, he paid an advertisement on the print newspapers in September 1987, and he was arguing that there is nothing wrong with America's foreign defense policy that a little backbone can't cure. And in the open letter to the American people, he was saying that he was asking on why America should stop paying to defend countries that can afford to defend themselves. And in 2024, Stephen Miram was arguing that if the reserve asset is the lifeblood of the global trade and financial systems, it means that whoever controls the reserve asset and currency can exert some level of control on trade and financial transactions. That allows America to exert its will in foreign and security policy using financial force instead of kinetic force, military. So, what are the tariffs for? I would argue that they respond to three objectives: ensuring that foreign investors finance the public deficit, reducing the trade deficit through the depreciation of the dollar, and safeguarding its international role. So it involves persuading American allies to cooperate in weakening the dollar and reducing the cost of public debt through the purchase of very long-term, low-interest treasury securities. Tariffs in this design play a multiple role: financing the public debt, improving competitiveness, threatening retaliation for unruly countries, and they are applied to a wide variety of situations. Think of Bolsonaro. Those who fail to cooperate risk higher tariffs or the closure of the American defense umbrella. In the new context, the extractive power, the primacy of the dollar must not only be maintained, but also monetized. So, the international role of the dollar is a privilege, but also perhaps a duty for the reserve currency. In times of financial turmoil, the Fed must act as the world's lender of last resort, extending swap lines to other central banks, enabling them to funnel dollar liquidity to commercial banks facing shortages. And this has been done, as the 2008-2020 crisis demonstrated, when the stability of the international financial system depended on the certainty of the Fed's safety net. But of course, this is also a formidable blackmail weapon. There is a very long quotation that you can perhaps find, but here again is Miran, who is arguing that this can and has been used as a blackmail for enemies and allies alike. And for instance, in 2018, Trump imposed sanctions on Iran and bullied other countries into compliance with US policy by threatening severance from dollar-based finance for any entity dealing with Tehran. Secondary sanctions are still now sanctions that deny foreign firms and financial institutions access to US financial markets and payment system may constitute the most important US economic weapon, not only against adversary states such as Russia, North Korea, Iran, but also against allies. This policy on the dollar, on the treasuries, can scare quite a lot of investors and foreign governments. And the question is, could Trump's attack on free trade also lead to attacks on free capital flows? That is, Could tariffs on goods can be a prelude to tariffs on money, as the Miron's vision may suggest? So the Trump's administration's aggressive foreign policy has increased fears that the dollar could be used as a tool of pressure or sanctions, giving rise to attempts to replace the dollar in international payments and as a reserve currency. And so we talk about crypto-mercantilism. So since scaling the markets can backfire, causing a flight from the dollar, are there other measures that we can use? And Donald Trump's strategy is the one of merging neo-mercantilism with digital finance to reinforce the international dominance of the US dollar. This policy promotes stablecoins, which are cryptocurrencies backed by US dollars, to maintain the dollar's supremacy while pushing for the development of crypto finance. This approach balances monetary control with crypto expansion, ensuring stablecoins serve US interests without threatening the dollar. So we use sticks and carrots. The US administration, writes Schaff, has made it clear through executive orders, congressional testimony, and social media that its support for stablecoins goes beyond just encouraging technological innovation. The goal is twofold: to protect the US dollar's global dominance by expanding its use on digital platforms worldwide, and to reduce borrowing costs by increasing demand for US treasuries through stablecoin reserve holdings. Through stablecoins, Trump could extend American financial and monetary influence, potentially increasing global dependence on the US dollar. Financial, technological, and military weapons are used together. So, I would ask three questions. First, will digital currencies become the new money, and are dollar-based stablecoins effective in strengthening the dollar and the US dominance? What are the implications for the stability of the international financial system? And third, what are the consequences for Europe and is the creation of a central bank digital currency an adequate and timely response? First, from cryptocurrencies to stablecoins, it's a game changer. Stablecoins currently account for a relatively very small share of the total US dollar-denominated monetary instruments in circulation globally, but they are virtually all dollar-based, and they are primarily used in cryptocurrency for the time being, but they have the potential to grow rapidly. Market analysts predict that the stablecoin supply could grow from 230 billion to 2 trillion. How much? And to encourage the widespread circulation of dollar-pegged and dollar stablecoins, the US is leveraging the strength of its fintech industry and its dominance in digital platforms, notably through its US big companies. And Trump promises to make the United States the crypto capital of the world. In this new context of geopolitical conflict, the development of stablecoins serves the dual function, as I said, of protecting the US dollar's global dominance by expanding its use on digital platforms worldwide and supporting demand for US securities, which are essential for financing the technological, financial, military complex of the United States, which is critical to certain US international dominance. So we have here the interconnection between money, big tech, data, which shape the boundaries of sovereignty. And this has been noted by, in a letter in March 2021 to the European Commission President, the leaders of all European countries, which noted with concern that data has become a new currency that is mainly collected and stored outside financial stability, I can skip that. There are several implications since these stablecoins are based on treasuries, US Treasury. Any change in monetary policy, for instance, for the Fed, which increases their interest rates, can have an implication for the demand for these assets and very, very serious implication for the financial stability worldwide. I can't go into this. Simply noted that a liquidity crisis could easily turn into a solvency crisis, so much so as the stable coins do not have access to the central bank as a lender of last resort. So there are problems for financial stability. And there is a problem also for banks in disintermediation, because if, and this explains the opposition from banks, and the choice of the Senate bill, which prohibit the paying of interest on the stablecoin assets, and also the proposal for the European digital currency to put the cap on the amount of digital currency of the euro digital to 3,000 euros, not to disintermediate banks. One can ask what is the utility of having a 3,000 euros cap. And there is a problem of regularity arbitrage and the race to the bottom, because if the United States are developing this stable coins market and the European Union is developing its own stable coin markets, the regulations of these different markets can entail a race to the bottom. The one who is least regulated could win the problems of financial stability. So, let me go to the last point. What is the position of Europe in this new monetary order? The European Central Bank fears that increased use of dollar-based stable coin will unleash currency substitution effects. A large part of domestic payments is already facilitated by non-European players. We all have credit cards in our pockets, and they are all non-European credit card issues. So there is a problem of control of monetary payments, and there is a problem of monetary sovereignty. Domestic monetary and financial conditions are determined by the authority that issues the unit of account. So, the central banks influence the interest rate across the financial system, thereby affecting monetary conditions across the economy. Without positive demand for central bank money, the link with interest rate would weaken or disappear, undermining the ability of the central bank to guide monetary conditions. So, monetary sovereignty is lost, and domestic monetary policy becomes powerless. This is what worries our European Central Bank. And they argue that taking a forward-looking perspective is crucial because network and lock-in effects heavily influence how money and payment systems evolve. The dynamic could entrench suboptimal developments that can become exceedingly difficult to reverse. The larger the footprint, the harder these would be to unwin. The other problem that is really a worry is the Euro's international role. Given stablecoins' borderless nature and their potential role in trade and finance, the Euro's international role is also at stake. Dominance of the US dollar will provide the United States with strategic and economic advantages, allowing it to finance its debt more cheaply while exerting global influence. For Europe, this would mean higher financing costs relative to the United States, reduced monetary policy autonomy, and geopolitical dependency. Geopolitical considerations are of increasing importance. Consider, for instance, the possibility of, on the part of the American government, of using the Fed swap financing facilities in the event of a liquidity crisis response to this challenge could provide an opportunity for the euro to emerge strongly. So, what are the obstacles? Very briefly, we need, in order to develop a stable coin based on euro, a huge platform that we lack. We don't have the big tech platforms that the US have. We need to overcome banks' opposition, and we need to develop a huge market for EU secure assets. And somehow here argues that the rearm policy could provide, if that financed, this huge asset market that is still left. Summing up, the US government might give stable coins a bigger role, making it a staple of banking and monetary policy. This development is closely connected with the administration's strategy of strengthening the American think tank military complex. The US plan will have serious consequences not only on the European Central Bank's financial and monetary policy, but also on the development model that the EU wants to pursue. Whether the European Union will succeed in following a different path, in strengthening its nascent fintech industry for purposes other than the war economy, in gaining autonomy from the politics and dominance of the US economic, financial, and military complex, is a possibility that is becoming less and less real given the political division of its member countries. And yet, in the next context of geopolitical rivalry and currency competition, an international role of the euro could respond to several objectives, including strengthening Europe's commitment to the energy transition, promoting agreements with producers of critical materials, offering an alternative source to dollar and increasingly yen-denominated loans. Many emerging countries are already implementing a process of replacing dollar-denominated loans with renminbi. The euro could represent an alternative to both. A replacement for the dollar is unlikely to be seen, at least in the medium term, and if nothing replaces the dollar, we are moving towards a system of multiple digital currency islands, a world without an hegemon, in which it would be good if the euro could carve out a place for itself. Thank you.
So, we finished. Very quickly, we will take some questions from the audience, and then we will finish at about 10 or 15 minutes maximum. So, Rita.
From the Universitat and member of the steering committee. I have a question for Professor Simonazzi. I think that we are not observing, in this case, the elephant in the room. I'm thinking about China and the Global South. They are planning to do a central bank digital currency. They are allying with India and Brazil, and so maybe what is trying to do the American administration is just something to trying to stop this increasing power around the world of China and the South, with all the new technologies they have, even without war, I don't know, it's really even without, but even without wars, they are gaining power over the world, and they are trying to still be in the room, even if there's a big elephant inside it.
Who else?
My question is for Euclid. I'm not quite sure I understand your distinction between neoliberalism being dominant rather than hegemonic. sounds very much like a classroom case, not like what actually is occurring in the world. Consider the elections in America last year. I would basically, to make it short, refer to the title of a famous book by Colin Crouch, which was The Strange Non-Death of Neoliberalism. My impression is that social consent is still very strong in favor of neoliberal policies, even though those policies are against the interests of many of the people who vote for those policies. And yet they keep on voting for them. So the distinction between dominance and hegemony is, I believe, something that works in a university classroom, but not out there.
I have a question for Monica and for Tobias. Maybe it also rounds up with the beginning, with the first one, because I want to ask about what Ursula von der Leyen had in her speech at about the State of the Union, and she made some announcement what the European Union will do in solidarity with what's happening in Gaza, and I want to maybe know what you think of those measures that she said that they would have. And I want to ask Tobias the same question that I had in the beginning about competitiveness, but now with militarization, and I want to ask you if you could give us a little bit of an idea of what you think, how much investment in armament does Europe need, or do we need any, or what, yeah, so like if you could have 1 or 2 points on that I would be very, very thankful, because we need it for discussions and changing the hegemony.
It's a question for Tobias Pflüger. In your account of the development of militarization in Europe, you mentioned, you used the word they are doing this, they are planning this, which was sort of a continuous actor. Well, you mentioned that numerous times. Could you explain a bit better who the they are, who are behind this?
Is there another question in the audience? Okay. If there is not, we can start from
Yeah, question about China and the Global South. It's true, China is trying to participate in this game, trying to have a renminbi or stable coins, and the other countries in the Global South can perhaps make a sort of coordination club. What I was arguing or trying to argue is that an international role of the euro could help perhaps the European Union in not colonize, but possibly participate and collaborate with these countries. And for instance, participating in financing projects and all that. Trying to make a sort of alternative to the predominance of the dollar and perhaps also of the yen. I'm not sure that a multi-currency system would be more stable, but I mean, there is a possibility to play a role.
Monica?
Thank you for the question. I think it's actually a very important and good question to ask. There are two things. I mentioned it a little bit in terms of, so her speech was, I think, on the 9th of September, and the article I referred to in The Economist was published 2 days later. that it highlighted how Israel gained diplomatic insurance by supplying weapons crucial to Europe's defense as the headline. And I think that is one of the key elements. I think what she announced in terms of what the EU might be doing, in some aspects has some similarities to some of the things that Sanchez's government has also announced, but that actually are not going to happen beyond the kind of narrative element. Particularly, I'm referring not necessarily to the humanitarian, possible support, etc., but very specifically to the possibility of stopping purchasing or selling arms and technological things to Israel. So I think that is something that will have to be seen how that really kind of carries out. One of the big problems, I think, at the moment is that, for example, what I mentioned in terms of the exports from the EU to Israel, in terms of arms and ammunition, if you actually break it down, that category specifically, over 80% is ammunition, which is specifically dangerous in a war. You know, you could argue that you sell a tank for training or something, but ammunition in a war situation is very clearly used for one thing and one thing alone. So I'm kind of dubious as to whether, particularly that part, the part of what to do in terms of the selling and buying of arms. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the really big elements has to do with technological warfare or technological warfare tools in a sense, so things to do with drones and things to do with biometric data tracking and all those elements. That will be impossible in the current system to stop, particularly because many of those companies today have affiliates in the countries themselves. So for example, the contract I mentioned that Spain signed with Palantir, the 20 million euro contract that they recently signed, this was actually signed with the Spanish affiliate of Palantir. And so you would then have to really trace exactly where all these affiliate companies, and then are you going to stop your government or the EU from buying something from a company that's based in the EU, which it might well be. So it becomes a really difficult thing to operate, even if you might decide that, well, we're going to create some kind of embargo. The embargo will have some impact, but very, very limited.
Who is they? Good question. In my impression, when I make an analysis about the power constellation inside the European Union, I see that unfortunately the German government is one of the main players. And for me it was very interesting, as Ursula von der Leyen was defense minister, I was in the parliament, and we have had a case about corruption with her and with the state secretary. And at the point, as we get her, she goes to the European Commission. It was a little bit okay, so you can solve this problem. And it was so typical that one of the big players, as a person, they take to another level. And in my impression, when I look to the Commission, for example, you have some of big players there, but also the governments inside the European Union, especially of the big member states, are this one who have the biggest influence. Germany, France, and so on. And when I say they, I realize that it's something, I call it the military-industrial political complex. And this is, it's a group of players and a group of governments which try to be the majority in the European Union. So I would say these are they. And this brings me to the other question. I believe that we have a very special situation in the moment. Because in Germany and in the European Union, they give so much money to the military they never have done before. And I discussed it in the parliamentary group of the left in Germany, and I said to them, you have to realize all other parts of politics are dominated from this. Look to the budget. They bring, meanwhile, it's clear that what is the goal is they have half of the budget for military. It's unbelievable, and it will increase, and in the other parts, especially in social issues, they will cut. They say it in Germany. Mr. Merz said very clear. The social state we can't finance, he says. Clear they could finance when they don't take all the money to the military. It's a very simple question, meanwhile. And so I think it's a crucial situation in the moment, especially in Germany and in the European Union, that the decisions for this unbelievable high military budget, its meaning, and you have it described, it will have the effect that there will be cutting in the social, the money for social issues. And so I think it's a big call for the left and for all to do something against this totally wrong priority. Because it's obvious. And so this would be my answer. When they do the priority like this, it's a call to do something against this militarization. And so I'm happy that Germany has signed against Rearm Europe. That's very important because, especially as a German, I don't understand rearm. That means arming again. You remember what happened the last time in European? There was so no rearm. I think it's obvious that we all have to do against this rearm Europe, and so it's wonderful that you have it on the agenda.
Yes, yes. Very quickly. Should we start from rethinking the coordination between fiscal and monetary policy in the way to remove weapons from the ends of financial markets? Maybe it could be the easiest way. Of course, we should coordinate at a global level. This is the most difficult thing to do, but maybe we could rethink to the way of financing public intervention.
Let me say something about that and the question about the euro, whether it can become a reserve currency, before I answer your question, which is mostly directed to me. Basically, I think Europe is a free rider in the world economy. So Europe is based on a German dominance of a country that is a small open economy. And the definition of a small open economy is it doesn't matter what its demand is for the rest of the world. Whereas Europe is clearly not a small open economy. It's a large, closed economy. So if you're not a European, and you're from Latin America or China, you see the following. You see that when there's a financial crisis, the Fed bails you out, as you pointed out. And when there's a growth or depression crisis, something like China takes up the slack and the recession is not as big as it would have been. So if you want to be a reserve currency, and there's an argument for and against that, you cannot not have responsibilities for the world economy and its demand. You're part of that system. And if you want a free ride on that, nobody's going to take you seriously. So irrespective of how you do it, if you don't take your, and that's why I think the question was relevant, if you don't take your responsibilities for the world economy seriously, I think it's obvious that the world economy shouldn't take you seriously. And I think that the rest of the world doesn't take Europe seriously, because Europe does not feel that it actually does something for the world economy. So if just give you a concrete example, if there's a huge recession in China in 2035, then a serious Europe would have a role, would take up the slack and expand its demand. And there's no way, without coordinating fiscal and monetary policy in Europe, that it can do that, or will do that. So that's my take on, I'm not convinced that we want to be a reserve currency, but if we did want to be a reserve currency, that would be. Now to the question, I'll remind you what the question was. The dominance hegemony distinction I made is more for the classroom than the real world. So I'll answer the question in two bits, one at the level of economic theory and economics, and one at the level of politics. At the level of economics, I came to Greece, I was a lecturer in Kent University, and I came to Greece as an associate professor, or an assistant professor, I think it's a translation, in 1993. In 1993, for a heterodox economist, we could not speak and be taken seriously about industrial policy. We couldn't speak and take seriously anything about tariffs. Now, if you read Republican economists at the moment, they are actually saying that neoclassical economics is not for us. In fact, because I made this parallel between the First World War, most of you who are not from Britain won't know there was a big debate in Britain before the First World War about reintroducing tariffs, preference for the colonies. And that was associated at the economics level with a group of economists that were associated, they're called the English Historical School, and they were associated with the German institutional economists at the end of the 19th century, challenging Walras and all the neoclassical economists. So you could actually now read serious Republican economists writing books about tariffs, about industrial strategy. That seems to me at the level of ideas, what used to be the Washington consensus of neoliberalism is not what it was. So it's not hegemonic in the sense that everybody agrees. Now, at the level of politics, when I came to Greece, it was very similar in most of Europe. There was a centre-right government, the centre-left governments, and they agreed on the Washington consensus. It was the time of the third wave. Clinton, Blair, Jospin, Gonzales. Yeah, there was a complete consensus on economic policy. Now, that is not the case. Macron has now just lost his second or third, whatever it is, prime minister. And he came to power with a complete neoliberal strategy. The whole narrative was that France is overtaxed, isn't favourable to companies, it has an inflexible labour market. He hasn't brought growth into the strategy. He wasn't even willing to do the compromise that people were trying to save him, which was a 2% tax on the 1,800 French people who have an income above 100 million. So that means some of them had billions, yes, just over 100 million. And his government fell. There's no centre-left, centre-right interchange. Labour now is in power and Farage is at 30%. The government in Germany, I mean, the CD is is in power, one of its lowest percentages of the vote ever. These are all signs that there is no, that you can impose some neoliberalism, cutting taxes on the rich and so on, you can impose it, but it's not as if people are saying, well, we're roughly okay, we have a consensus. Roughly the Washington consensus, it's not perfect, and there's still some poor people and some people who are unemployed and clochards and so on and so forth, and we should look after them. But basically for the mass of people, and significantly, not just for the elites, but for a significant part of working class and middle class people, the system is not working. And that means, that is not hegemonic. That is dominance, and that's why we have this instability. I mean, I don't know what country you'll come from. I grew up in England. The idea that Boris Johnson would become Prime Minister, I mean, he's a joke, yes. I mean, Truss was even more of a joke. I don't know, or that Trump could become President of the United States. That's not a sign of hegemony. That's a sign of a system that's disintegrating before our eyes. So I'll defend myself that it's not just for the classroom. Thanks very much for the question.
You reminded me all the time as an interpreter, from the beginning till the end. So thank you very much. Thank you all of you. Thanks to all of you. And then just remember that tomorrow we will start at the rooms. I mean, we have parallel sessions, not plenaries. We have one plenary at the end after the parallel sessions. And the parallel sessions take place at on the first floor. Look at the rooms. At the desk there are people that are going to give you instructions. First floor and second floor. So look at the workshop that you are speaking at, or you want to follow. And I hope that you are coming with us to dinner. I don't know how many of you have registered, but you are welcome. And tomorrow we see you at 9 o'clock. Thank you very much.